Good evening all and welcome. A Merry Christmas to each and every one of you. Tonight I have 15 scary stories that happened around Christmas time, and as is my holiday tradition, I've invited along my friend Killer Orange Cat, who's narrated 5 of tonight's stories. If you'd like to listen to more stories from both of us, a link over to a video over on his channel to keep up the festive horror can be found at the end of the video or in the description. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was around 14 years old, a peculiar incident took place. My mum had taken up a secret Santa shopper at a store located in a mall, leaving me in charge of my 3 younger brothers. Their ages were 5, 4, and the youngest was an infant. Typically, secret shopping assignments don't take much time, but rather than simply sitting on a bench outside the store, I wanted to engage the boys in something more entertaining. I must admit, I had never believed in Santa for some reason, but my 2 older brothers did, so I thought it would be amusing to observe their interaction. I asked my mum if I could take the boys to see Santa, and she agreed. We made our way to Santa's workshop, where the boys excitedly approached him and engaged in the usual conversations about toys and their behavior. However, when Santa attempted to hold the infant, he began to cry unconsolably. In retrospect, I should have trusted the baby's instincts and left immediately. Strangely, Santa started commenting on how I was too old for regular gifts from him, but he had an offer for me to become Santa's special helper and receive a very special gift, among other creepy remarks that I no longer recall in detail. Disturbed by his behavior, I declined his offer to hold the baby and sit on his lap, expressing that we had to leave soon anyway. Santa persisted and even placed his hand on one of his thighs, gesturing for me to sit there. Sensing the urgency, I fabricated a story to my brothers claiming that I saw our mum approaching and it was time to go. However, the mall was eerily empty, except for a few elderly individuals using it as a walking path. My younger brothers saw through my deception and insisted on staying, as they hadn't spotted our mum. As I prepared to put the baby back in the stroller and convinced my brothers to leave, Santa glanced around and abruptly grabbed my arm, forcing me to look at him. In a chilling tone, he declared, "It is very naughty of you to lie. I think you need to be punished." Luckily, at that very moment, my mum truly appeared and called out for us. This sudden intervention compelled my brothers to finally leave with me. I confided in my mum about the unsettling encounter, and she swiftly rushed us to the car. She then informed me that she intended to return to the mall and report the incident to mall security. Regrettably, I am unaware of what transpired after, or if any actions were taken. Nevertheless, that encounter left me with an enduring discomfort towards Santa and other mascot characters. Consequently, if I ever have children, I will refrain from taking them to see Santa. The unsettling encounter with that creepy pedo mall Santa has left a lasting impression on me, and I sincerely hope that our paths never cross again. 10 years ago, I, then 16, had eaten a lot of Burger King on the 4-hour journey to my grandparents' house. When we arrived to see my nan, it was Christmas Eve, and, as I still do now when I get excited or happy, I jumped around the house, which combined with the Burger King lunch, made me feel really queasy. This was a sadder Christmas than usual, as my grandpa had passed away earlier that year from Alzheimer's, but my family were determined to lift my nan's mood by making it a fun Christmas. Now onto the spooky bit. I decided to sleep off the self-inflicted nausea while my family took my nan to the local fish and chip shop, leaving me on my own in the bungalow my nan and grandpa built themselves. I was woken up by the sound of loud music. It was Nat King Cole's song, which is my nan's favourite artist. Being sleepy and not thinking straight, I asked my grandpa to switch it off. Immediately the music stopped. This made me wake up properly, as of course my grandpa had passed away. Tentatively, with my heart racing, I left the bedroom and shouted to see if the rest of the family had got home, but they hadn't. I was still alone. I went into the living room and saw that my grandpa's stereo system had a Nat King Cole CD inside it, so I unplugged it and went back to bed. It wasn't long after falling into uneasy sleep that the Nat King Cole music blared out even louder. It was so loud, it was reverberating around the bungalow, and I started to cry and freaked out. "Grandpa, please turn it off, I don't feel well." The music stopped. I didn't want to get up again, so I stayed awake until my family came back about an hour and a half later. After telling my mum, she checked the stereo, and sure enough it was unplugged. Since then, my nan's dementia has gotten worse, and she often forgets about my grandpa, remembering only about a handsome, kind man and stroking his photo for comfort. The stereo still comes on loudly, usually when she's being difficult to care for or unpleasant, a horrible side effect of dementia, and it calms her immediately. We all think it's our grandpa, in his own sweet way, saying as he used to, "Don't worry, pet. It's all gonna be alright."
My first year in college, I wasn't able to afford to travel home for Christmas break, or winter break, whichever one you want to call it. I stayed in my dorm room for the entire period of time. My parents shipped my Christmas presents to me, and I really dreaded my very first Christmas all by myself. Now, I've heard plenty of stories from other students who had to spend time in their dormitories all alone. Most of them tell about how lonely and isolating one can feel in such big buildings all by themselves. My experience was very much like that too. The semester was over in early December, and that very weekend there was a mass exodus of students from campus. And by Sunday morning, the campus had turned into a barren tundra, frozen and empty. There were still a few weeks until Christmas though. I have to admit that as the days went by and the loneliness became worse and worse, I began enjoying a little bit too much to drink, and by the time that Christmas had actually come around, I was really dying for some contact with some other people. I wanted to go out to a bar, but I was only 19, and although I could easily get alcohol from the liquor store that was known for never carding, I wasn't brave enough to go into a bar all by myself. I did, however, begin talking to a townie about a week before Christmas. It was online. I was telling him how much the cabin fever was getting to me, and I was not brave enough to go to a bar. He told me that he was having a Christmas party on Christmas Eve, and that I could come over if I wanted to. I'd been on the fence about whether I wanted to go to a stranger's house on Christmas Eve. However, I was so lonely by the time it came around that all my hang-ups were gone. I checked with him and got the address. I didn't have a car, so I had to walk over to his house. It wasn't too bad of a walk, even though it was really cold outside. It was also snowing that evening. I walked through town, following the directions I was given. I ended up going down a street, and eventually finding a brick townhouse with the address on it. I had to check to make sure, because there were no lights on in the house at all. There were no cars on the street either. While I texted the guy, I walked past the house. I asked him to confirm the address, and he did. I then casually asked him how the party was going. He told me that there were a lot of people at the house, and that the party was hopping. He was looking forward to me getting there. I couldn't figure it out. I mean, there was no indication in any way that anyone, much less a whole party full of people, were at that house. So I worked up my nerve and decided to walk past the house again. I checked the direction of the street, wondering maybe if the house I had gone by had a south address and not a north one. Nope. Everything indicated that the dark house I had gone by was the place that this party was supposedly going on at. So what was I going to do? The situation was just really weird. I considered just walking up to the house and knocking on the door. Maybe everyone had walked to the party, and the party was going on in the basement. I didn't know, but I couldn't explain the darkness and lack of cars, and there was supposedly a hopping party going on. I walked down an alley in order to check out the back of the house. There was nothing different. I couldn't find any windows to a basement to see if there were any lights on, and it was while I was standing there in the alley trying to figure out what to do when I heard a horrible scream of agony come from inside the house. I stood there for a moment before I panicked and moved up against the wall. That's when I heard another horrible, agonized sound. It was definitely coming from inside the house. I left the alley and ran a few houses away, and then called the police and reported what I saw, anonymously. A night later there was a news report on the television. 2 men were arrested for torturing a college student in that house. The defendants claimed it was hazing, but that didn't help them any. I knew it wasn't hazing though, because I had been invited to the house too, and I was sure the other guy was too. And Lord knows, I wasn't a member of any fraternity.
This happened around 4 or 5 years ago when I was 15. It was early Christmas morning, and my sister and her boyfriend had just come over. They were in the kitchen socializing, drinking coffee or tea, maybe snacking on some stocking stuffers. Typical behavior for us to do before opening presents. Now, before I say exactly what happened to me, I think I should sort of describe the general layout of the house so you can get an idea. When you first come in the front door, there's a short hallway going straight before you're met to the kitchen. If you continue through the kitchen in a straight line, you'll walk into the dining room. Then, you'll take a left, and there's some stairs and the living room. The dining room was mostly empty, as it had the dining table actually inside the kitchen, so we set up the tree and presents in the dining room instead of the living room. I was patiently waiting to start opening gifts. I pulled up a chair to the tree and sat there for a while with my back turned to the kitchen while my family was behind me still talking. I was sitting there, and all of a sudden I heard what can only be described as an evil voice whisper in my ear. The reason I describe it as such is because I don't know what else to call it. If you've ever played video games, watched movies, or shows where there's a demonic character, then imagine what its voice sounds like. It was very deep, and a hint of distortion or slight lisp. What it said I don't know, it just sounded like gibberish to me. It lasted about 3 solid seconds and gave me goosebumps at first because I was startled. It was directly in my ear, as if I had been listening to ASMR. I started giggling and swatting my ear and turned around to look at my family, and they all stopped to look at me wondering what I was laughing at. I saw all of their expressions turn from smiling to questionable, and then to a straight face in the matter of seconds. They said that my whole face had turned pale white when I realized that no one was behind me. I kind of stuttered and asked who was behind me playing noises, and they said no one. I thought of the possibility that it was just a joke, but I'm pretty certain it wasn't. The kitchen was around 15 feet behind me, and between the time that the noise stopped and I turned around, there's no way someone could have run from me to the kitchen, got into the position they were in, then acted oblivious. Also, the floor squeaks and the room's hutch would shake if you were to run that fast across it. That sort of prank is extremely random and wouldn't have made sense, at least not for anyone in my family to do. So, I pose the question to you. What on earth do you think it could have been? I want to share a story of what happened to me on a trip to my grandparents around Christmas time in 2015. This is something that has never happened to me since then, and never really happened to that extent before. I never spent the night at my grandparents' house very often growing up. They had a really neat ranch, and I always hated the feeling of being in the dark there, but that was it mostly. After my parents moved far away from them, things changed, and I'd spend a day or two before and a day or two after Christmas at their house. My grandmother collected lots and lots of antiques after she got married, and her house was so full of them that it was a cool place. Things became different when we made this shift to staying at my grandparents' house for a few days every year. There was this feeling of rules that I got from the house, or maybe I learnt them. I had to be in my bedroom that I always stayed in there by 11 p.m. Otherwise, a feeling would well up around me. It started low and slow and would ratchet up with intensity. It would hit me even to go into the bathroom or back out the bedroom. It was like an incredible and dreadful feeling of being watched all over, combined with a silent screaming that I couldn't hear that would slowly get louder. But after 2 a.m., the feeling would be gone. One trip I decided to try and ignore it. I told my parents about the weirdness and what I'd felt, and they told me it must all be in my imagination. I was a young man who'd graduated college, so I felt really mature and had a big brain. Everyone else went to bed, and I remember sitting on a lazy boy chair watching Full Metal Jacket on the TV. It was 11, so I was a little aware, but I just turned all the lights on. I had a really hard time focusing on the movie, and I started to feel like I was being watched. I'd looked towards the area where my brain was suggesting the attention was coming from, but there was nothing there. It continued to get worse and worse, like a heavy weight bearing down on me, and freaking me out to the point that I grabbed the remote to turn the TV off, when suddenly the feeling stopped. I was totally comfortable and thought that I had faced my fear. After 20 minutes later, a painting on the wall suddenly shifted. I was very startled, as the painting was very large and it made a thud sound. A second later, the couch from it shifted away from the wall about an inch. Suddenly, the intensity of eyes on me and the silent screaming was turned up to 11, and I remember switching off the lights and TV and fleeing to my bedroom. However, it somehow felt worse while in the bedroom, like I was being pulled by a weak force into the closet. I felt sick and remembered crying. I fought the urge and pulled and retreated to the bathroom. I shut the door and locked it, and sat on the floor by the shower opposite the door and watched the door trembling. I thought about crying for help, but my parents had made me feel so bad about things when I told them before. I knew I wasn't going to be able to share this with them. Everything again calmed for a minute, and I got on my knees and watched a pencil roll off the bathroom counter and under the door. I watched it roll down the hall and under the floor in my bedroom. I closed the bedroom door and waited. I remembered I had my phone, so I looked at the time. It was 30 minutes to 2 a.m. I waited on the floor, and when 2 a.m. came round, I felt the grip fully go, and I felt safe again. I opened the door to my bedroom and for some reason felt totally safe, and was able to once more sleep in my bed, exhausted, but feeling relieved. The next morning I woke up and went to the living room. My parents and grandparents asked me about the couch and painting, and after explaining I had no idea, I helped them put everything back. After breakfast I opened my closet door and saw a few startling things in it. A shotgun with bullets, and access up into the dark attic with the hatch fully open. And as you can imagine, I have never slept or been in that room since. My question to everyone: what the heck do you think that was? And what are your impressions?
A few years back, I had a really terrifying experience during the Christmas season. I am married and I have children. I have a boy and a girl. My son had already grown out of believing in Santa Claus, but my daughter was young enough to maintain her belief. In fact, she was always looking forward to heading to the mall, so she could ask for what she wanted for Christmas. That year was no different. She was all joy and happiness as we headed off to the mall to make the yearly visit. My son, of course, would not be taking part in the sitting on his lap, and would likely spend most of his time in the video game store or in the arcade. But my daughter's face was lit up brighter than the star on the tree. The line at the mall was long. I mean, that made sense since it was the weekend before Christmas, so we were going to have a really long wait. It wasn't a problem though, because her excitement was apparent throughout the entire wait. When my daughter finally got to sit in his lap, she seemed fine at first. However, after a moment or two, her expression changed. She began to look scared, and then she began to squirm. For the first time ever, my daughter jumped off his lap, ran over to me, and buried her face against my leg. I was surprised, but I guess I just figured it could have been any number of things that had spooked her. The rest of the time at the mall, she kept as close to me as possible. She insisted that I hold her hand throughout the entire time. I began wondering if maybe she was just a bit freaked by the number of people at the mall. We did a little last bit of Christmas shopping, and then I gathered the children together to head home. The ride home was no better. My daughter insisted sitting in the front seat, which annoyed her brother to death. But I let her do it. She just seemed agitated the entire way home. At home, things were just like they had been. My daughter was upset by something, and I had to ask her what was wrong. However, the only response was that she would shake her head, indicating she was not going to tell me. This began to go on for the next day or so, and I really could not begin to even understand what was wrong with her. She seemed nervous. Hell, she would not even lay in front of the Christmas tree and look at the lights, which had been one of her favorite things to do. It continued up until Christmas Eve. I wanted to go ahead and put the kids to bed so they could get up early in the morning. My son had no issue with it, but my daughter began to panic. She tried to keep from going to bed. When I told her she had to go to sleep, or Santa Claus would not be coming, she actually told me she didn't want him to come. She asked me to do whatever I could to keep him from coming. Well, of course I was confused. When I asked her what was wrong, she again shook her head. I tried to explain to her that if she was scared of something, the best way to get me to be able to protect her would be to tell me what she was scared of. After pausing for a few moments, my daughter finally revealed to me why she had been upset for the past few days. At the mall, when she was sitting on Santa Claus's lap, she said he whispered to her, "If you've been naughty at all, I'll be coming to kill you on Christmas Eve when you fall asleep." My daughter was upset because she knew she hadn't been 100% good all the time. I was furious, of course, but I couldn't do anything about the mall Santa Claus that night. So instead, I told my daughter that the man wasn't the real Santa Claus, and that the real Santa Claus wouldn't hurt her no matter what. She wasn't convinced. So I asked her if she had ever been naughty in previous years. She admitted she had, and I told her Santa Claus hadn't hurt her those years, so why would he this year? Amazingly enough, that actually worked. I also stayed in the room with her until she went to sleep. In the morning, she was finally fine, and we had a great holiday. I reported the mall Santa Claus to the mall, but without any evidence other than our word, they couldn't do anything about it.
My grandma died when I was very young. It affected me deeply because she had been watching me at the time while my mum was out. She died in front of me, and I reacted the best I could being a child. I went to my aunt and uncle's house who lived behind me. All I knew was that something was wrong with Grandma because she'd fallen down the stairs. The EMTs came after they called 911, but nothing could be done. She had passed. For the longest time, I had trouble dealing with it. I spent the longest time blaming myself and hurting deeply over it. This has been the most traumatic experience in my life. Shortly after she died, we moved into the home she lived in to take care of my great-grandma. Though with time, it has healed as best it can. The one thing I do think about when I think of Grandma is Christmas. If there ever was a truer person that embodied the love and spirit of the season, it was my grandma. She would gather all my relatives, aunts, uncles, and cousins to her house, for a holiday feast and gathering together from far and near, because Grandma was pretty much the matriarch of the family. The entire glue that was our family was held together by her hands, not to mention her food. If there was one thing she could do well, it was cook, but her expertise, I think, was baking. I have fond and vivid memories of gathering apples from the apple tree in the backyard for her, where she would bake pies, crisps, and whatever else she could do with them. Though her cookies were the best. I loved my grandma's cookies, and she made the best in the world. I'll stake my life on it. I remember her kitchen always being filled with the most wonderful smells, and I recall a time during the holiday season when I was really missing her. It had been many years since she had passed, and I was still trying to come to terms with her death when I was so young. I was sitting in my bedroom thinking about it, and talking to her in my head. I was feeling rather upset over it. "I miss you, Grandma," was the thought in my head at the time, when I heard a huge sound erupt from the kitchen. The sound was a clash of pots and pans, almost like someone was getting them out and tossing them on the countertops. We had cats at the time, so I assumed they were being difficult and knocking things over. So I went into the kitchen to investigate, but there was nothing. Not a cupboard opened or anything strewn about, nor was there a pot or pan out of place, as well as nothing at all on the countertops themselves. It was confusing, to say the least. I shrugged it off as an odd occurrence and went back to my room. It was at that very moment that the whole house filled with the most pungent and wonderful smell of someone baking. Not just the kitchen, but the entire house itself permeated with what smelled like a mix of brownies and cookies being made. My heart was strangely warmed by it, and I'd forgotten about being sad, though it dawned on me that it wasn't just a weird occurrence. I'm convinced that it was my grandma coming back to comfort me, to let her know I was still around, to tell me she loved me in the best way she knew how. The story doesn't end on that note, however. When my mum came home from work that day, as soon as she walked through the door, she said, "It smells like someone's been baking in here." Merry Christmas, Grandma. I personally have no recollection of this event. This was told to me by my mother and was confirmed by my father, who is the most non-spiritual paranormal person I have ever known. You don't want to talk about ghosts with him. He's strictly scientific, and if one doesn't provide a DNA sample, it does not exist. So during the Christmas holidays, years ago, my parents were sleeping in their bedroom sometime in the early morning hours, when they suddenly awoke, and noticed that the room where my crib was illuminated with a bright white light. They immediately thought that a burglar or someone had entered the home, so both my parents jumped out of bed and ran into the hallway outside of my crib room. Before they could enter my crib room, a ball of bright white light exited the room and went into the hallway. Instead of panicking or being frightened, they both said that when the light came out of the crib room, they felt the most peaceful sense of well-being and happiness. All the fear they initially felt had vanished, and they just stood there, watching this ball of light, not moving. They watched the ball of light float out of my crib room, through the hallway and then down the stairs, where it disappeared around the corner into the living room. My parents hurried down the stairs to see where the ball of light went, but it was gone. However, once they were downstairs in the living room, they saw the angel ornament atop the Christmas tree had been knocked over. I have asked if there was a window open in my bedroom, thinking it might have been ball lightning, but they said no. However, I wonder how good memories are about particular details years later. My mother says she believed it to be an angel, and my father says he doesn't know what it was, but it was an incredible and unexplainable experience. If my mother had told me this, I would kind of wonder if it actually happened. But the very fact that my father confirmed this story, and knowing how he thinks, I have to believe their account. Whether it was an angel, I doubt that, because I don't believe in angels as described in the Bible. Nevertheless, I find that the sudden change in the feeling to be extremely intriguing. If I were to see a ball of light and it was in the room of my child, I'd probably freak out. But my parents went from being panicked to being utterly at peace. I don't know what that was, and have not been able to find similar accounts, but I would love any links or hear comparable experiences regarding this ball of light, if anyone could share it with me.
When I was younger, I recall my older brother always trying to keep me from believing in Santa Claus. It was like a mission of his. I never really knew why, but whenever he had a chance to try and prevent me from believing, he would. On one occasion, while both of my parents were not at home, he snuck me into the room and opened the closet. He showed me the presents, not yet wrapped. That wasn't enough to cause me any issue until later that year, when the presents I had seen were tagged being from Santa Claus. I eventually brought this up to my parents, and they told me that Santa Claus brings some presents, and the parents buy some too. I was quite happy with that explanation. I needed to get that information out of the way, because it does affect what happened one Christmas morning when I was 11 years old. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, there were presents from the family being put under the tree, and bit by bit, the tree was getting filled with presents. Hell, by Christmas Eve I was surprised that Santa Claus would be able to fit anything extra under there. It was a pretty good present year. I remember going to sleep that night, my belief in Santa Claus as strong as ever, and when I woke up, I recalled going downstairs to check out the Christmas tree, which had gained so many more presents. It was an exciting morning. Of course, we all had to wait until breakfast before we began opening the presents up. But that was minor. And once it was done, we began. Every year we picked one person to go under the tree and find a present for each member of the family. And this year was no different. I got a lot of really nice presents that year. Little by little, presents under the tree began to deplete. The floor was covered with wrapping paper, and there were gifts everywhere. Now, almost everything had been opened. My mom went over to the tree, and she picked up a box. It was wrapped in different paper than any of the other presents had been. It didn't have a bow on it either. All it had was the name label on it, and it was to me. But there was no indication as to who the present was from. My mom gave my dad a weird look, and I recall seeing him shrug. So she just then handed the present over to me. I got the wrapping paper off the present pretty quickly. It was like a plastic Tupperware container, opaque, so you couldn't see what was inside it. I was further confused, but decided to open the container to find out what was in it. The stench from the container was overwhelming. Laying inside the container were several dead and decomposing snakes. I, being 11 years old and at this point extremely frightened, screamed and jumped back from the container. My dad went over to it and saw what had scared me. He immediately turned to my brother, asking him if he had done this. My brother, however, seemed just as frightened as I had been. Plus, we had no idea how he would have gotten snakes, let alone killed them. My dad took the container, sealed it, and went into his garage. At first, the only thing that had worried me was the present itself. I was too scared to even consider the possibility that the only way it could have gotten under the tree was if someone had broken into the house. But when my dad returned from the garage, he explained to my mom that the garage door was ajar. It was open, just enough so that someone would have been able to roll under it. Someone had indeed broken into our home and left this ghastly present under the tree for me. We didn't have anything like CCTV cameras or anything like that. There was nothing we had that could indicate who the person who broke in was. My parents ended up not calling the police, figuring Christmas had been tainted enough without taking it further. I never found out who left that present under the tree. I figured maybe it was the neighborhood bully, and that they would give themselves away by gloating about it. No such luck. No one outside of my immediate family ever expressed any knowledge of that bizarre Christmas gift, and to this day, I don't know who, how, or why it was left for me.
My sister is 2 years older than me. I was approximately 15 when this occurred, so she must have been around 17. It was Christmas Eve 2004, and we were stuck at my grandmother's house in Michigan. My grandmother was at her home in Florida, but my family stayed at her Michigan house to be near other families in the area for the holiday. It was painfully boring that night, and my parents had gone out to dinner with other adults. That meant it was just me, my sister, and our little brother who was about 5 years old at the house. I remember putting my brother to bed and going to sit on the couch so that I could plug my new laptop into the internet. Suddenly, my sister in the living room starts yelling to get out of her spot. She wanted to plug the internet. I didn't know what I said, but I'm sure I didn't want to give up the internet spot without a fight. Nothing was physical, but the yelling woke my brother, and I put him back to bed and returned to the living room area. At that point, my sister was in the kitchen. She looked at me, apologized, and offered me the internet plug, and I was surprised, as she never apologizes. But after all that, I had decided to go to bed and spend the rest of the night texting my boyfriend, so I cautiously accepted her apology but declined. She then proceeded to try and convince me to sit there. When I reiterated that I was going to bed, it was like a switch went off. She didn't say anything, but I could see it in her eyes. Those eyes changed and suddenly were focused at the butcher block of knives. The next thing I know, she's reaching for the knives which were between us. I grabbed the Windex bottle that happened to be next to me and sprayed her face before turning and running down the hall. As I ran, I could hear her yelling at me and coming down the hallway too. I went into the first room I came across, which was a bathroom, and locked the door. Within seconds, she was banging on the door. I called my parents and told my sister they were coming. For 10 minutes, she tried to break down the door, but suddenly there was silence. What broke the silence was her voice, apologizing again. This time I knew better and stayed away. When my parents arrived, there was a butcher knife under the couch pillow, directly in front of the bathroom in which I was hiding. It was then that I realized the internet spot she wanted to give me faced away from the kitchen. I have no doubt she planned to kill me. This happened back in 2016, during Christmas week. I was in 9th grade back when my parents took me to Mexico. I was genuinely excited but scared because of how much crime there was there, allegedly. Right when we get to Michoacan, I notice that where my grandma lives is by the end of a road in that village, and past the end of the road is nothing but huge hills. I asked my grandma what was past the hills, and she would just say that farmers would take their goats over there to eat the grass. Fast forward to nighttime, when I was asleep, I woke up so suddenly at 2:37 a.m. and started looking around to see what had woken me, but I couldn't find a possible answer as to why I was awoken, so I sat back down. I began scrolling on Facebook when I started to hear horse hooves stomping on concrete with chains being dragged on it. I got back up and listened closely and heard the horse screaming as if it had been startled, but I swear it sounded as if the horse's screams were right in that room. And I remember the horse was walking, but it seemed as if it didn't want to move away from our gate. It was as if it was only targeting my relative's house. 5 minutes later, I recall my mum saying, "Son, go back to sleep. It's the devil." The very next day I asked my mum about what happened at night, and she said she heard it too, but she knew it wasn't a farmer since they all have a strict code of not being outside past certain hours. I don't believe it was a farmer, because if it would, I would have heard his herd of sheep as well. Could it have been The devil on a horse?
I can't really explain to you how weird this story is, and it just happened very recently. Christmas Eve, in fact. It was warm outside. We have had a few cold days here and there, but the temperature was in the 60s. But interesting enough, the wind was blowing, and it was blowing hard. I checked on my phone, and it was like blowing 20 miles per hour. I had been at my mom's house for Christmas Eve. We were having a great time, and then my mom was driving us home. We got a little freaked out when the oil light came on in the car, and we had to pull over to the side of the road. While my mother called my stepdad, I was looking out the window, and I noticed this weird thing. I included the video of it in this message to you. I'm sure it's just something normal, but I couldn't make out what was going on. I'm just telling you some weird things that we saw that night. We're not really to the part where the really scary thing happened, though. But this was not the last of the weird things. Now we have an next-door neighbor who we are positive has some sort of illegal business going on. I'm not really sure what it is. I think she's either a hooker or a drug dealer. I swear to God, I see all kinds of vehicles outside her place, and all of it happens to be a very little, old dilapidated single-wide trailer. All sorts of weird people go there, and I have counted over 100 unique cars that have been in her driveway at one point or another. Well, me and my two housemates were sitting on the porch. It was pretty late at night on Christmas Eve. I was the only one of us that was facing the neighbor's trailer, however. There were 2 trucks in the driveway and people sitting there in both trucks. Now you know at first, despite the suspicion that I had about my neighbor, I wasn't giving this much thought really. It wasn't unusual. However, with the longer and longer amount of time that was passing, and these trucks just kept sitting there in the driveway, the more and more I became suspicious that something was going on. Then I began wondering if it had something to do with us. I mean, think about it. Whatever my neighbor was up to, I was sure it was illegal in some way. It wasn't completely weird to us. Our neighbor across the street was a known drug dealer. His sister lived on the same block, and she was a drug dealer. A previous tenant of that very trailer was a drug dealer. It's just the neighborhood we lived in. But what started bugging me was the idea that maybe these 2 guys were sitting in their trucks waiting for us to go back inside our house. I mean, who wants to do something illegal while 3 people are out on a porch watching them? After a good hour of this, the 2 of them got out of their trucks. I watched one guy, and in the light I could tell he was leaning on a cane. He walked very awkwardly, almost having difficulty holding himself up. It reminded me of the movie Jeepers Creepers. There was a scene after the creeper was badly injured, and he was walking, hobbling along very difficultly to the police station. By overhearing a couple words of his talk with the guy from the other truck, he hobbled this way because he had a wooden leg. They then talked for a while, and I heard some words, and there were some looks at us over on the porch. I truly got the impression that they wanted us to go in our house, or something, but I couldn't do it at that point. We were too close to them to really talk without being heard, so I kept trying to silently communicate with my friends. After what seemed like forever, the 2 of them got back in their trucks and played a game of musical cars. The truck that had been in the front drove off, while the guy with the wooden leg hobbled up to the door of the trailer, which opened to let him in. And this was just a very weird and creepy thing. I was thinking how they'd just been sitting out there for at least an hour. The lady who rented the trailer had never come out. I knew they had been talking about us, and I just asked my housemates how much weirder this Christmas Eve could get. "Didn't you hear the neighbors across the street arguing?" one of them asked me. I admitted that I did not. I was paying way too close attention to the people in the house next to me. Apparently, our neighbors across the street had been arguing pretty loud, though. By now it was past midnight, and it was Christmas Day. I guess they hadn't gotten a Christmas tree, and the man and woman who lived there, the other drug dealers, had been fighting loudly about it. And then they were quiet. And then we heard something that no one expects to hear on Christmas morning. A chainsaw. All three of us looked at each other, stunned, but we were able to put some sense into it. There were trees behind those houses, and we figured the man had gone out, and he had tried to cut down a Christmas tree. And that was when our Christmas took another turn. We could hear some yelling and screaming. They were closer to the house again. We really couldn't make out what we were hearing until we heard a loud scream of, "Shut the fuck up, or you're going to be the Christmas tree." We then heard the chainsaw throttle and a scream from the woman back in that area. At first we panicked, thinking that the woman was going to get killed. I mean, those two fought all the time, and people were used to it, but threatening her with the chainsaw was new. There was some commotion, though, and then the chainsaw went silent. We didn't know what was going on until we heard him demanding her to open the door. We figured out that she must have run from him into the house. The chainsaw was no longer giving us any scary noises. This was just some of the normal fighting and yelling that went on between the two of them, and eventually the voices died down. The lights came on in their living room, and we just assumed things were back to normal. It was a weird Christmas Eve indeed. We almost got stranded on the side of the road. Saw this weird thing we couldn't explain. Had the weird feeling we were preventing a drug deal from going on, and heard our neighbor threaten his girlfriend with a chainsaw. At that point, we decided to go in and watch Christmas movies. It was just too much like Halloween outside.
When I was 13, I was passing a football on Christmas Eve with a friend outside. My family used to always have a Christmas Eve party, so my buddy and I thought we'd go out front to toss the ball and get some air. It was great weather, snowing slightly, cloudy sky reflecting the city lights, and it was pretty warm out. I remember it all being very pleasant. As we were passing the ball around, something incredibly odd occurred. The whole street, or as far as either of us could see, flashed white several times. We both thought that it was super weird, and it wasn't isolated to one of us. We both experienced this intense flash multiple times. We looked around and couldn't figure out what it might have been. I joked, aliens, but we went back inside to ask if anyone had taken pictures, and no one had. We were also the only people on the block having a party that year. We never did figure out what it could have been, and if anyone else has ever experienced anything remotely like it, I'd love to hear from you. It's something that has stumped me for the longest time. About 3 years ago, my ex-boyfriend, his two friends, my brother and I went on a night hike. This place is an old abandoned amusement park off the side of a mountain with access up to the mountain from the amusement park location. This place is quite well known to the locals, and most smart people hike there during the day. My ex-boyfriend had this photo that he asked his friends to send him. At first glance, I assumed his friend photoshopped the picture. I was skeptical because who the heck just takes a random picture of nothingness? I live in a pretty cold state, so we are all bundled up and headed to the torn asphalt towards the amusement park. I still remember the air feeling quite still. There was a snowstorm predicted to happen on Christmas Day, so the air had this creepy stillness to it which made it a lot more exciting. As we headed up the grassy hill, passing the amusement park and towards the mountain, things were getting a little tense. My ex-boyfriend, who's my ex for very specific reasons, brought along his beloved PBRs. The higher we up the hillside of the mountain, the drunker he got. When we finally reached the top, they came across a radio tower. This excited my ex and my brother for some reason, because they needed to climb it. I started panicking and telling them to get down. At this point, it started misting out. It seemed like the start of a storm. The air was electrifying, and I was extremely anxious. I realized I couldn't change their minds, so I decided to walk away. I couldn't stand the idea of seeing my brother plummet to the ground or get electrocuted. I walked away and towards the tree line. I walked until I reached the side of the rocky cliff. It was more comforting to be alone even in the darkness. I stood there enjoying the view of the many streetlights twinkling down below. I remember taking deep breaths and just feeling a lot less anxious. That view is always beautiful during the day, but at night it's a whole new experience. It was until my ex and the whole crew came to join me, except their idea of joining me was to hang off the side of the cliff, like literally cliffhanger style. Maybe they were inspired by those parkour videos. This set me off, especially since my ex peer pressured my brother into doing it. I started to raise my voice and demand them to stop. My ex found a small ledge off the side of the cliff to stand on, and he yelled at me to come over here right now and that I needed to see this. I looked over the side and saw the descent our bodies would have to travel until finally reaching rock bottom. He started pushing me to stand on the small ledge. After some time, a stupid past version of me decided to give in, and I inched my way down to the ledge. He told me to turn around and look at the view. I felt like I wanted to cry. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he said. All that I could think about was the possibility of plummeting. I wanted to climb back up to safety. I felt dizzy like the world around me was spinning, and finally I climbed back up. My ex-boyfriend's foot slipped in front of me, and I surely thought that's when it was all over. But he was able to catch himself and I was just hyperventilating. I started to bawl my eyes out. They wouldn't stop playing cliffhangers. My ex yelled at me and claimed I was crying in order to get attention from his two friends. This angered me. I tried to explain myself, but of course he wouldn't listen. I was afraid for their lives. I was very shaken up and angry, and decided to speed walk away from the mental abuse. I walked and didn't look back, and made my way through the bush and down the grassy hillside. I walked until I couldn't hear the ridicule from my ex or his criticizing laughter, and finally I was alone by myself with my overactive thoughts, with no light but just the moon above me, as well as a dead cell phone. 20 minutes later, I reached the bottom of the hill. The abandoned amusement park buildings were to the left of me. I had a clear view of the street in front of me. About a football field away, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. A figure made up of light, almost floating up the street and towards the amusement park. The figure couldn't have been some car lights, because the gates to the amusement park were locked up. This was far from civilization to be illuminating anything. It was a figure, and a very tall one, about half the size of the trees around it. The figure illuminated the trees around it. It had massive wings. I distinctly saw what I saw as soon as I saw it. I crouched down into a ball with my head between my knees and cradled my head with my arms, and I just wept. I was extremely scared and alone with no phone juice, and I was afraid this would have seen me or something. I was just too scared to look up, and I sat there sobbing quietly, waiting to hear something. After about 10 minutes, I heard my boyfriend singing his stupid, drunkard song from a distance. When they saw me crying, he automatically assumed I was still upset, but when I explained what I had seen, they surprisingly believed me. We stood there staring out into the distance and finally decided to carry on walking. Well, after he realized he lost the knife he had on his person, and he decided to run up the hill to find it. He then ran down the hill after realizing it was no use, and ended up tumbling down the hill and hitting quite a few rocks on his way down. Interesting night. We made it back to my car, but got very little sleep. It was probably the worst Christmas Eve ever.
My dad was always doing some pretty bad things after my mother passed away. I could understand being depressed and stuff, but he did have 4 kids to raise still. Instead, he lost himself in a bottle and never found his way out. The worst Christmas I ever had was when I was about 13 years old. This was back in the late 80s. Almost 2 weeks before Christmas, Dad took us all to the store, gave us $25 apiece, and told us to buy our own Christmas presents. We did, and then we went home and wrapped our own Christmas presents. I can tell you without doubt that none of us believed in Kris Kringle anymore that year. Knowing what our presents were, none of us were eager to get out of bed and open gifts in the morning, so we figured we would sleep in until we were ready to get up. 4 loud, deafening gunshots in my bedroom not only woke me up, but caused me to pee the bed for the first time since I was like 4. My brother and I had shared that room, and we both woke up in shock. My dad, who was probably up all night and staggeringly drunk, was in the room and holding a gun. He had shot it at the ceiling 4 times. "Get your asses up already and open your fucking gifts," he told us. I really wanted to clean up first, but he wouldn't let me. I had to join my brother and sisters and peed in pajamas, opening presents before he let me change. He sat there with his gun the entire time. Fortunately, we didn't live with him much longer. One of our aunts took us in. I don't know what happened to him. Whether he's alive or dead or what, he just disappeared from our lives. I don't really miss him.
When I was maybe 4, we had to spend Christmas Eve at my uncle's house in Wales. We had a big pheasant dinner with all the trimmings. I specifically remember having Brussels sprouts that were very bitter. That night at around 3 a.m, we were awoken by a bright flash that filled the whole house, and a plate-rattling shudder. I mean, every room in the house lit up with a brilliant blue light that left us all awake and near blinded for a few good seconds, like a camera flash went off inches from each of our faces at the same time. Meanwhile, Bracken, my uncle's Irish setter, started going insane in the living room, tearing around the place, knocking over tables and barking at just about anything. My uncle got the dog cooled down, and everyone finally got resettled, but I remember asking my mum what just happened, and she simply didn't have a good answer for me. Ball lightning? Some sort of piezoelectric discharge from minerals beneath the house? Who knows? Who am I kidding? It was Santa. I'm sure of it. A few years ago, I was driving my grandparents' 4-wheeler on their property, talking to my younger cousin. In the middle of the property, there is a pioneer cemetery. They don't legally own it, but they do own everything around it. Anyway, we were coming back to the house, and as we passed the cemetery, I heard a very distinct bell, similar to a bike bell. I asked my cousin, and he said he heard it too. We looked around and there was no one around, and the house is too far away to hear yelling, let alone a bell. We went back and looked at the graves to see if any of them had died around Christmas, though none of them were marked, so we never found out. However, many are unreadable and have just years. It's very strange, and to this day I still can't explain where that bell come from.
When my mother became a single parent, I was 14 at the time, and the 5th child of 7 siblings. I had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, juvenile diabetes, 5 years earlier. I was on a steady regimen of insulin injections and a rigidly controlled diet. I was exclusively under my mother's care, but especially after she divorced the old man for irreconcilable differences. The old man is what we called him after he proved to all of us that he was no longer our dad. But that's another story. We moved from Memphis, Tennessee to Little Rock, Arkansas. Our only brother had already married and decided to stay behind. Because our remaining household was all girls, my mother was exceptionally careful to see not only to our health and well-being, but to our personal protection and safety as well. She taught us to defend ourselves, and protection and safety as well. She taught us to defend ourselves and take nothing from anyone we didn't know, while at the same time always showing respect and kindness to everyone that deserved it. We learned to understand the innate danger of being a female in the world. We never walked alone, and with only each other. My mother was tough, young, beautiful, experienced, and above all, nobody's fool. She taught us the same, which we all took to heart. My mother took me everywhere she went, and because she happened to be friends with the manager of a convenience store where she worked at the time, I was allowed to stay in the store while my mother worked. Liability was less of an issue then. Naturally, I helped her in any way I could, especially when she was busy with customers. I got paid in little items I asked her to get for me that I couldn't get on my own. My mother and I loved singing Christmas carols, but what the owners passed for Christmas music, the same 10 songs, personally sung by members of their own family, over and over again for 8 hours, hung over our heads like a noxious gas, but for the ears. It drove both of us completely insane. Tim Burton and Johnny Depp could have included it in Nightmare Before Christmas or Sweeney Todd. I remember one particularly cold and windy day in early winter. Light snow had just started to fall. I was riding with her to work and watching the snow hitting the windshield and blowing and swirling little eddies. It would dance intermittently and then blow off and away like magic fairy dust. Still, I have never liked the cold, even though I love the outdoors, and found myself, more than once, whimsically wanting to know what it would be like to be inside a single crystal snowflake. Even I knew in my agile young mind that this was not possible. Not so much, I logically reasoned, because of the impossibly cramped space, as the enveloping and pervasive cold. I rolled down the passenger side window and stuck my head out, trying to catch just one snowflake, which proved impossible, thereby proving my point. After I began to get shivery, I pulled my head back in just as we reached the store. After getting out of the car, we noticed for the very first time, like ever, it was snowing on Christmas Eve. There were visible drifts of snow in certain areas around the parking lot. My mother grabbed a handful and tossed them at me. I squealed, "Good one." In turn, I grabbed a bunch with one hand while protecting the one gift we were allowed to open every year on Christmas Eve. Alfred Hitchcock and the Three Investigators, Secret of Phantom Lake, Book 19. I had already read all the other books up to that point in the series, and eventually got them all. Remembering not to hit her around the head area, I decided to fling the snow all down the front of her coat. She laughed her little girl laugh and yelled, "Kathy, don't you hit me in the face now," and her half-hearted order to stop. Just as she got to the door, however, I let go of a last parting shot and hit her square in the butt. The single, glancing note that issued from her perfect throat would have broken glass had it not been shatterproof, like, say, the windows of the convenience store. "You better stop that, or I'll spank your little behindy, honey," and then fled into the store with me, right behind her. It was so cold out there, I told myself, I was afraid I might start growing snot sickles. I remembered hearing once that some people didn't like snow in the forecast. To me, it was cheery and magical, cold, but beautiful. With Thanksgiving over and Christmas Eve arrived, we had redecorated the store for the holidays. It was one of a chain of magic markets that were locally owned. Mike, our resident store manager and close gay family friend, was particularly cheerful because my mother and I had won the contest for the best decorated store. He was particularly proud of that. My mother and I won $100 for that. The only problem ever mentioned about the store was just that the owner's supposedly festive, piped-in holiday music was positively unbearable. Mike mused sarcastically that it was because the owners had sung and recorded 10 of their favorite songs as a way of including all the staff in their personal holiday cheer. Too bad that didn't include a free turkey or some wild turkey to really celebrate or, as it were, drown our sorrows. Of course, I didn't drink alcohol at that age. Mike used to joke that their version of cheerful holiday music was enough to gag a maggot. As the afternoon drew on, I noticed that one of the coolers was down, so Mike called a repairman to fix it. While the repairman was in the back, I was in the front, helping my mother stock shelves. She spent most of her time at the cash register helping the customers. I remember how she had this way of pinning her long raven black hair above and behind each ear, to not have to fuss about her hair and her eyes, and she was working. I'll never forget how, during the summer months, the sun would highlight her full, rich, thick black hair, so black it was practically blue. Her hair and her looks were the envy of most of the female customers, and some of the males that came into the store, both young and old. I, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. Long, straight, blonde hair. To my discerningly independent mind, I didn't like it. I wasn't like hers. I noticed the repairman walk by in his one-pieced forest green coveralls with the long sleeves that almost covered his hands. I must have been reading far too many detective stories back then. I always had a good eye for observing the world around me, though, especially strangers. I think I got it from my grandmother. I remember watching him as he crept across the floor, hesitating momentarily, as though he'd forgotten something, and then deciding against it. I had this creepy feeling, like the feeling you get when somebody's watching you, that he wanted to turn around and look at me one last time before he shuffled out the front door and away into the darkening night. And that irked me. I was about to tell my mother about him when the box of cat food I was pricing slipped out of my hand and almost fell to the floor. The thought flew out of my mind and was instantly replaced with what I wanted to get as a little something extra for our 4 cats for Christmas. We had a long-haired, black and white male tuxedo cat named Boots, so naturally when we got a silver point Siamese cat with blue crossed eyes, we named her Slippers. And her twin sister, Samantha, who was also a silver point female Siamese with blue eyes. And finally my own chocolate cream tortoiseshell cat named Shiloh, one of Samantha's kittens. Yes, the self-same cat of Shiloh and the Shadow of Sound. Scary story. I took several cans of cat food, along with some fuzzy catnip mouse toys for the fuzz buckets, over to my mother after calling out to her, across the aisle and over the den, if it was okay. Of course it is, honey. She half distractedly called back. I placed them on the counter in front of her, and then went back to finish up some of the pricing. I remember standing towards the back, furthest from the front doors while facing them, when the door chime sounded, alerting us that there were customers that needed to be greeted, and sold to if necessary. I remember the relief we would feel when that awfully cheery holiday music, and I do mean awfully, was blissfully interrupted whenever the door chime sounded. Our sanity would return, even if only momentarily. We plotted desperately about leaving the door open just to cut out the horrid music. But then we thought better on it. If the music was only going to be replaced with the incessant door chimes or the sub-freezing cold. When I looked up, I recognized one of the men. It was the cooler repairman with the oversized coveralls. What was odd about him this time was that he was with another guy who was wearing the same forest green long-sleeve coveralls that actually fit. I had all but completely forgotten about him up until he came back through the front door, accompanied by his much larger Carnival Funhouse mirror twin. I tilted my head to the side, reacting involuntarily to the coinky-dink of it, and after looking at my mother, who was still too busy to bother at the time, sighing, I resumed stacking the cat food cans on the top shelf, facing out towards the customer. Finishing one shelf, I noticed the picture of the still famous orange tabby cat named Mortis on the front of a can. Aside, had it been today, I would have found myself thinking of somebody by the name of Killer Orange Cat and his mascot Ichigo? Maybe? But I digress. Then I heard a loud, clear male voice order my mother to give me the money. My head jerked up to see a man with a pistol placed right between my mother's eyes. I found myself unable to move. I was literally paralyzed, frozen to the spot. Transfixed, stuck. I watched helplessly as my mother reached under the counter where the paper bags were kept and slapped a small brown paper sack on the counter. Calmly and concisely, the man with the pistol resumed, "All of it. Now." Then she emptied the cash register with what was still left that she was supposed to put in the floor safe, but she hadn't got around to it yet. Putting cash in the floor safe was a store policy when the money in the cash register exceeded a certain amount. My mother's personal routine was to take any money that exceeded that amount and put it in a small paper sack under the counter to be added to the floor safe later, especially when she had too many customers or was simply too busy at the time. When the man with the pistol came in, along with his crony, and ordered her to hand it over, now, she had reflexively smacked the sack full of money on the counter as well. Normally she would never let the amount in the sack exceed about $50, but because we had been so busy, it was about 9:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve, the amount that had steadily grown up to about $350. Watching the whole thing play out, like some live Christmas morality play from further back in the store, I discovered that I was somehow superglued to the spot. It wasn't so much that I dared not move, as I was incapable of moving, while I just stood there like a dork, playing the part of the convenience store mannequin. My mother, as usual, handled it with the utmost grace and dignity. I kept thinking over and over that if only I could move, I might be able to help her. Then I heard the man with the gun repeat again, but this time louder, "All of it." The other man, the unkempt repairman, who was standing behind her, started to move towards me. Her dark brown eyes flicked in my direction, the fucking gun unmoving at her forehead. I thought again that I'd gotta do something. I was too scared out of my wits, but growing angry by the second. I hated the way I felt and fought back tears. When the other man started moving towards me, my mother bellowed out, in as unholy a voice as I had never heard before, one single, terrifyingly enunciated word. "No!" It was the most guttural, animal, otherworldly sound I'd ever heard. It was more like a command than a plea. It was both menacing and wicked. I knew only too well what it meant. The man who was moving towards me obeyed immediately, as though he had run against an invisible wall. She had stopped him blind. Then I heard a loud crack like thunder, a shockingly loud noise I will never forget, the most evil, ugly, and awful sound. 1 second I had been watching the man approach me, but now he seemed to be moving in slow motion. In reality, he had darted swiftly back to where my mother had been only moments before, but had disappeared. I remember them looking at each other, wondering where she could have gone, but in slow motion. Somehow I was seeing them moving really slow, as though they were being pushed back by a current of air and water. I too tried to move, but discovered that I was still unable to move a muscle. I couldn't even tell if I was still breathing. It felt like I later learned about sleep paralysis. I was completely aware of everything around me, but I was simply incapable of movement. It was terrifying. It was all happening too fast, I told myself at the time. My mind was simply incapable of processing what was going on. I wasn't shot, I reassured myself. I was in shock. The entire scene up to that point played and replayed over and over, and repeated itself again and again in my mind. It was all as though I saw it, but did not see it, while at the same time seeing it. Now I could not unsee it. I blinked. That simple reflex was the first sign my body had begun to wake up. I might actually move yet, I told myself. It felt like hours since the robber fired his gun into the ceiling, but I knew it could not have been more than a few seconds. When I realized I could no longer see my mother, I feared for the worst. Nonetheless, I forced myself to watch where the two men were going. They were moving swiftly now towards the front door. I saw when the gun-wielding fuck gestured for Tweedledee and his dumb self to get the hell out of there. I felt the air become thick as a smaller one with the oversized clothes passed me and leered back one last time before he too went out the front door. With the clarity of a snowball hitting me in the back of the head, I realized my mother had screamed the way she did. The other one, the sick one, he had been coming for me. After what seemed like, and very nearly turned into, an eternity of silence for both of us, the electronic door chime sounded one last time as they scurried out of the store. Other than the ringing in my ears and my desperate gasp for breath, I slowly began to break free from my paralysis. Trying to remain calm, I laughed to myself that the only good thing that came out of all this was that the gunman fired into the ceiling. He somehow managed to kill one of the owner's demented, notoriously off-key renditions of one of the most beloved Christmas songs, Silent Night. The owner's solo rendered it into more of a bearing of the cross than a celebration of the spirit of Christmas or the birth of Jesus Christ. I thanked my God and silently thanked my mother that the mind-numbing music had ceased. I remembered that even in the worst situations, there were always things to be thankful for. This was the first cause for celebration along this curiously weird and terrifying Christmas holiday. The felonious twins would have been long gone into the blue onyx night sky had it not been for the real cooler repairman standing at a payphone outside in the parking lot, and nothing but his long underwear and socks. They had little Santas all over them. He was standing in ankle-deep snow calling the police. The two robbers tied him up and stuck him in the back of his van and took both pairs of his forest green coveralls as a disguise, which, as Christmas gifts go, only proved the worst for the short, lustful little robber fuck. What gave him away was his coveralls proved to be way too big for his height and weight, and made him look more like a little kid trying to wear his dad's work clothes than a serious felon. I could only imagine what had happened when he had been packing a gun as well. The second cause for celebration was when I finally got complete control of myself, after I felt a warm, soft, and familiar hand touch my ankle, and then two strong arms climbing up to me, and finally wrapping herself around me, holding me and gently rocking me awake. My eyes filled with tears, They were wanting to spill out, but I still couldn't let them. Turning around, I looked directly into the large brown eyes of the only woman I had ever loved in this life, my mother. I had never experienced such clarity of purpose in my too young life before. "You're all right," I spoke, finally. "She's all right," I thought silently. What had happened after the shot was my mother had dropped instantly, reflexively, down to below the counter, and began working her way towards where I was standing, unable to move. That was the Cherokee on her father, my grandfather's side, quick, fast, and sure. I understood by and by that the most horrible thing that could have ever happened to her, apart from losing her own life, had nearly happened to me. Something so unfathomable, unthinkable, and yet she and I were still alive and unhurt, at least physically. But by this grace of God, faith in Christ, and my indomitably willed mother, we would never have made it. That was the third cause for celebration that Christmas Eve. The dynamic duds had gotten away with about $95 from the cash register, but had left behind the tiny brown paper sack my mother had loudly and defiantly slapped down on the counter when they first ordered her to give me the money. There was about $350 worth of 20s, 10s, 5s, and 1s they didn't know about at the time. I'd like to think they found out later. The police caught the twin disasters just outside the store. The gunman, the apparent leader of the group, had seen movement at one of the payphones and decided it was time to make their escape. He must have thought that nobody knew about the robbery yet, or maybe they really had been moving in slow motion. Fortunately, my mother had a few friends in the police department too, so when they got the call from the real cooler repairman, the police staked out the area, and as soon as they came out of the store, they were quickly greeted and arrested. Fortunately, they hadn't thought to take hostages. My mother's "no" must have put that thought out of their mind. She probably would have killed them both had they tried. Not long after, my mother quit that job and found another with me, again in tow, by her side. For months after, the whole thing kept replaying itself over and over in my head. I felt guilty for not being able to do anything to help. I had frozen either in fear or in shock, or both. As it had turned out, my mother assured me that it was exactly what I should have done. I was, after all, only about 14 at the time. This wasn't some Christmas play. This was real life. My mother, God willing, Christ, and myself had all played a part in a very real-life drama that could have turned into a real-life tragedy. And when you think about it, everything that could have happened to avoid a double homicide, kidnapping, or worse did happen. I'll never forget that my mother's Christmas gift turned out to be the best gift I could never have imagined getting. Her love for me, along with God's protection, made this the best and final reason to celebrate the Christmas holiday. Note: this story is dedicated to the store manager mentioned in a previous story for KOC as Thomas, but due to his current decease, I felt it incumbent upon me and my love and friendship to give him his actual first name, Mike, in the story. Here's to you, Mike. May the owner's personal cheer not follow you into the next life. Love and miss you, old friend.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. If of course you did, let me know down below. A huge thank you, as always, to Killer Orange Cat for joining me this festive season. If you'd like to hear more, a link is on screen now and at the end of the video, and a huge thanks as always to my members and patrons for their continued support of the channel. Hopefully, see you over on Killer Orange Cat's channel. But until then, stay awesome. I'll see you in the next one.